Well, good evening. It's fantastic to be here. We've had an amazing 3 days. I first met Chris in Stockholm, and he is an incredible character. And over the last 2.5 years, we've been working towards this moment. So delighted to be here. It has been amazing to connect with advanced practitioners here in New Zealand over the last 3 days. And hopefully I'll have a few minutes within this talk also to kind of share some reflections on that. But I'm based here. I took this photograph from my office window. This is actually a colour photo. But we're very privileged, based at the Treasury, overlooking Big Ben. You can actually feel Big Ben when it chimes. So initially when I first arrived 3 years ago and became a civil servant, originally trained in industrial design, and found myself as a civil servant, the sound of Big Ben every 15 minutes was really, really obvious. Really good to keep on time for meetings. But after a while, you kind of get used to it, but it's still there, this kind of huge sonic boom every hour and every quarter past a little one. So if I were to reflect a little bit on the last three days, if I wrote a book about it, I'd call it Postcards from the Edge. And one of the things that we talked about is about the edge of emerging practice. And Tim Smith, who created something called Eden Project in the county of Cornwall, where I live in the UK, said if you're not on the edge, you're taking up too much space. And there's something really powerful about being on the edge. In our policy lab, we see ourselves as existing on the edge of government. We are within, but we also are legitimate in reaching outside of government to connect with citizens, to connect with businesses, to connect with academics, industry, experts, but most of all, to connect with future practice. And so we set up the lab specifically to do that, to ensure that the civil servants and policy making was world-class and would be embracing a place that could embrace the future. So a number of things that we've been talking about over the last 3 days relate to these different boxes. So the 3 days we kind of started off thinking about building teams, thinking about the context, the kinds of toolkits, and how design is a fantastic tool for embracing complexity, the complexity that we see in the world today. By day 2, we started to kind of experiment, and we were thinking about designing government and ethnography and the way that designers have used ethnography to better connect with people's behaviours and needs. And then towards today, and a little bit yesterday as well, we were looking at prototyping, we were looking at emerging practice. And I've got 2 case studies to share with you tonight that speak to perhaps more traditional use of design for digital, and then zooming right across to the emerging practice of speculative design. So in the lab, over the last 3 years, we've worked with 5,000 or so, just over 5,000 civil servants, and we've run about 20 projects, and they're all incredibly different. So in government, we see the role of design as not for design policy, but how can design support any policy area? And in the manifesto, the government laid out 400 priorities. So there's a lot of work to be done. And there's a constrained amount of time in which to do that. So how might the methods that are used more typically in industry be applied in a policy context? That was our question. And if the outside of the building you saw at the start, this is the inside of the building. And at weekends, they turn it into a film set. So they filmed Spectre there, and as you walk across this courtyard in the middle of our building, you can still see the marks where Daniel Craig had to stand, and it's quite fun. And so, you know, when they did the interior shot, it kind of struck me as interesting. They didn't film inside our building. They created a film set for that because the way that we work on the inside of government doesn't really reflect the kind of James Bond stereotype of the oak-panelled room. Our workplace is a lot like every other workplace. So you can imagine James, so Daniel Craig comes in his super cool car, and then he's like confronted with Post-it notes. It kind of doesn't ring true. So it's interesting how these kind of stereotypes continue. I'm really proud to be part of a team of people across government who are making lives better for people. And this is our Department for International Trade, and they're working on exports. And here you have a minister, Francis Maud, who was responsible for this department, and Audrey, who's the policy lead, an ex-Treasury official. So I just thought I'd play a quick video. So you really, I can tell you design is good and that we've been doing cool stuff, but I thought much better to hear from the minister himself and from a Treasury official.
Trade has been kind of stagnant at just over £500 billion a year out of the UK for the last 3 or 4 years. We want to amp that up to £1 trillion by 2020.
Openness takes us all, whether you're a politician, a minister or a civil servant, it takes you out of a comfort zone because we're not used to sharing in this open way. What you get in terms of value is huge.
Instead of experimenting with ideas that came from politicians, from our ministers, from our senior leaders, or from prominent businesses outside, really if we wanted to be a customer-centric organisation, we needed to be building ideas and services on insight directly from them.
Great that so many businesses wanted to take part and saw the value in it. I think we were surprised by how many businesses were willing to put in the time and effort.
Hundreds of people from all sorts of businesses turning up all across the country to co-design what they thought the perfect export support system would be. So we had professional facilitators in each of those locations, getting people to, rather than just talk about their experiences and the problems they've been having, actually to build, to prototype what they thought that might look like, and actually interacting with something that's much more physical, whether it's sketches or Lego or Play-Doh, helps them test their ideas on each other and build on their ideas.
It's the interaction with UKTI and how keen they are for business to grow within the country. I think it's a very exciting time.
Your volume of orders will just go through the roof.
It's about demystifying exports.
A list of manufacturers who want to sell in Ghana, and then a list of people, especially those from Ghana who are based in the UK.
And understand your product, then you need to go out and understand your market.
If you want to have good ideas, it's important to have lots of ideas. So it's very much in that spirit that we want to open up and generate a wealth of thinking, and particularly ideas that no one's ever thought of before.
We use data science and data analytics. We use much more traditional business analytics and quantitative information. We take the market research that has been done over many, many years, and we put it together with stories and anecdotes, but real human stories about their experiences of accessing export support services, the pain points, the dramas, what they find really, really difficult, so that we can understand and empathise with them as we redesign the services for them.
It's a completely different way of working. It actually speeds things up because you don't have the problem of producing something that's completely unworkable because you're constantly iterating it, constantly testing it.
So one of the really fantastic things I overheard from the London event, which was held at Google, was a business, as they left, he said, "This is the best event I've been to from the Department of Trade in 18 years." So it was really interesting to bring new approaches to government and to work on some of those challenges. In the lab, we talk about the 3 big enablers that will help transform the future in terms of design, digital and data. And in the lab itself, we use design to help us better understand people's needs and to think about how new solutions might come together. but also digital as an enabler and data science in particular as some of the evidence that we might draw upon. And part of the reason for having a lab is that the world just isn't standing still. If the world stopped changing, you wouldn't need this, in effect, R&D capacity within government. So I created this diagram just to kind of capture some of the emerging technologies, some of the third platforms that we're going to be seeing over the next few years. And, you know, it's everything from new smart materials, smart machines, a whole data revolution there, the Internet of Things, smart spaces, new systems, the way that we will create a sensing planet, satellite technologies, precision medicine. So many of these things will, in effect, change the way that we exist as communities, the way businesses operate, and the way that public services are delivered. So I always see design as enabling people to be on the front foot of that change, and co-design particularly to help communities and stakeholders to embrace that change in a way where they actually have a say. So the good news is these are all converging. They're not individual trends. We're seeing a huge convergence with that. So I mentioned co-design. It's been a big theme for us over the last few days. And the reason co-design matters is that Angela Dumas' work some years ago showed that 90% of design decisions are not made by designers. They're made by chief executives, they're made by buyers, marketing, civil servants, ministers, policymakers. And really, there's a whole question about how you could take a methodology like the one that design has and expand its influence to have greater effect. So I create this little diagram that kind of shows what I mean by that, which is there's a vast amount of professional design in the world. You think of the iPhone, you think of an Aston Martin, you think of commercial products. Anything that you will use will have a professional designer. But increasingly, that ability is complemented by working with and not doing things for people. So this whole idea of co-design, working with people, drawing on their insights, drawing on their experience, is incredibly valuable. Of course, the alternative is no design at all, and I think everyone is creative, but the real challenge is ensuring that the world that we occupy is well designed. So I'm going to give you two case studies, canter through them reasonably quickly. One on digital policing, which was the very first project we did in the lab, and then the second looking at probably some of the most recent work that we've done. Our digital policing project came to us from the police themselves, and they asked us to help them understand why so few people report their crime online. Less than 10% of people were reporting crimes online, and yet they knew if they could get citizens to report online, they could actually create a better experience in some cases, and also it would reduce the cost for the police, and that could be a good thing. So this was about digital transformation, but with an internet kind of starting point. And all our projects start often with one question that we say is the wrong question, and we use the whole first phase to actually find out what is the real question. So this is probably a better reflection of the question. How can we improve police support for victims in a digital age? Let's expand the question, and then the more possibilities come into play. We spend a lot of time with victims through the police themselves, working in the homes of the victims themselves to understand their journey. And it was quite interesting that we could literally on the day meet with victims in the area, and then in the afternoon we met with the policing minister. And I was able to say to him, this is live, in effect, data from the ground for our grounded research from today. We gathered together all of the experts from across the country and in some cases the world, leading criminologists, leading academics, service designers, policymakers, the police themselves, and did a massive co-design workshop where participants were prototyping and making future crime reporting services. And then that went on to refinement. We worked with the Royal College of Art students in London and others to start to build what a future service might be. So we were then delighted when the Home Secretary, the now Prime Minister in the UK, was able to say that that prototype in the International Policing Conference, that prototype could save the police £3.7 million and 180,000 hours of police time. So one of the real things, and one thing that I mentioned over the last few days, the reason I wanted to become a civil servant was I'd probably become frustrated that a lot of the design work I'd done outside of government had been kind of thwarted by lack of implementation, good ideas that just didn't happen. And what I've been amazed by is the difference by being within the system to achieve that accountability and that impact. So the other project I want to share with you is the opposite spectrum. This is total kind of futures work. And the project is called The Future of Aging. We know that societies are aging. We know that over the next several decades, we're going to have an older population. I saw a message today I thought was lovely. It said, if you take older and add the word B, it's a much better word. Rather than seeing people as older, let's see people as bolder. But the Future of Aging project was really about understanding everything about that future society. Not just what it was like if you lived and you were older, but what would it be like for young people living in a society where more people were older? So the Government Office for Science spent 18 months and they did reviews across the whole country, and they met with academics and did various consultations and roundtables. And they produced a 200,000 word report on that future. And when they came to the lab, they expressed their challenges, being the problem was that they knew the content of the report was really, really good. It was really sound. It was really well grounded in the latest thinking internationally and nationally. But their problem was that nobody was reading it. And some people weren't even reading the summary. And they knew that we had 20,000 policymakers in government who were going to be impacted by this future, but who, for one reason or another, either weren't aware or weren't changing their practice. So our job was to help them bring that message to the policymakers about what the future would be like. So what we did is we worked with a design agency to help us visualize all of the material in the report and turn it into an interactive workshop. So I'm just going to show you a little video from the workshop, and I might speak over it a little bit because there is a soundtrack, but it's not got any words. Might be a bit loud. So we were setting up these workshops, and we ran many of them with different policy areas. We ran them in areas of health, in transport, bringing together different policy teams in small groups. And each of the sessions started with kind of challenge setting about what the issues were, and then we set up something that we call an evidence safari, where you lay out the evidence visually around the room. And then what we do is we invite people to go and question the different evidence stations. So they take questions to the room, to the wall, and they work in groups. And the questions are things like, what do we not know? What data is missing? What is surprising in the data that we've already got? You know, what are the nuggets that we should be really considering? And so it was a way of interrogating all of this incredible data. And then we started to build personas, because of course the data doesn't have meaning unless we understand how it affects behavior and humans. So then from this came various mapping that helped us actually understand and generate ideas about the future policies in this new world that we were creating. And so this process we've been going over for the last 3 days, the policy work stream, we went through exactly these steps. We've done this now more than 400 times across different policy areas, and we've refined the process. So we're pretty happy now that we can pretty much use it on any policy area. We've used it on things like better understanding of homelessness, which is a project we're working on at the moment, and then the opposite end of the spectrum, anti-corruption strategy for the Prime Minister. So we've had a really fruitful relationship with the Government Office for Science, and we're still working together. And one of the things I'd quite like to be able to do is to take all of their knowledge about the future and build ourselves some futures cards that will be part of our evidence safari. So that's something I'm going to do when I get back to the office. So just to kind of bring it together in terms of what does that mean, how does that relate to design? We've been working on this, utilising some of the thinking around speculative design that came from critical design and the work of Fiona and Tony, who are now at Parsons in New York, around how do we use design as a mechanism to build the future? Because unless you can visualise a future, you can't necessarily create it. So we're looking at these probable, plausible, preferable, possible futures. And the example that, well, there's two examples from recent projects. The first one was from that Future of Aging project. So it wasn't enough to do the workshop. What we really needed to do was really think and put our feet in that future. So we worked with an agency called Strange Telemetry, and we visualized that future. And so this, if you can deconstruct it backwards, is the robot repair workshop of the future. So the Internet of Things is here and alive, we're in the future, and where do you go to take your robot to get it fixed when it breaks down? And so we created this shop, and then what we did was we were able to then use that in a workshop to get people to put themselves in that future and start to think about that in a way that they just wouldn't have done through reading the report. It worked so well, we thought we'd do it on another topic, and we were asked by the Department of Transport to work on the future of rail. So in that project, we started with ethnography. What's it like to get on and off a train? If you're struggling with a pushchair, does punctuality matter as much as usability in the experience? And then again, working with Strange Telemetry, we visualized future transport scenarios and used those in workshops. So they're just a couple of projects out of the 20 or so that we have been working on. It's been amazing to start from the position of practice and real, genuine evidence and bring people together to help solve some of the government's biggest challenges. And over time, we've built a lot of trust through doing that. We continue to work, but we also try to work at 3 levels. So we do the projects, but that's not enough. We're also really interested in building capability and sharing the methods. So we have an open policy-making toolkit. And we use this diagram really to sum it up, which is we do projects at the heart of our lab, but then we're also keen to build better practice, which will deliver more improved performance for government. But that is also not enough on its own if we don't change the system and the rules by which we operate. So we're also interested in looking at that from a policy lens as well. So we see these as design 1, design 2, and design 3, 3 levels of design, and how design can have greater impact by operating at both a policy and a practice level. So that's pretty much me in terms of the projects that we've been doing. In terms of workshops, it has been, as I said at the start, an incredible delight it feels like a real luxury to spend 3 days. We're so busy with our practice to actually stop and reflect and construct and draw on all of the things that we've been doing over the last 3 years to build the Workchops experience has been really valuable for us. I genuinely hope it was valuable for the participants, and it's good to see some familiar faces here tonight. It feels like there's some really exciting practice happening here, and one of the things that an event like that does is it opens up a dialogue. So I'm really keen that in the future that we can share the good examples that are happening. Certainly we can share more from our side, but it'd be really great to hear more about what you're doing as well. So a massive thank you to Chris. He has been phenomenal in all of this, and he is the man with the chicken. Thank you.
Are the ideas here quite sort of straightforwardly applicable to to the sort of core processes of kind of policy and legislative design, as well as the more kind of service delivery or future thinking? Because that's a kind of area I work in, and we try and produce these lovely looking bits of legislation, and then you put them out there and they fall over because you haven't actually thought they actually kind of might work. They look good on paper.
Yes. So our projects are really varied, and some, like the policing one, are very kind of digital and service delivery. But then the speculative one is quite a futures one. The other sort of area that we work on, about 20% of our work is not really public. And some of those projects are working in areas that are pretty much purely legal. So facilitating different departments to come together to develop new opportunities that will go through primary legislation, and that in those processes we don't do any ethnography, user-centered design, but we're using that same collaborative co-design approach, but in a much more abstract way. So there are a number of projects, and I had wondered when we started to be commissioned to do that kind of work, whether the design toolkit could stretch that far or whether that was too far. And in a way, our role was to kind of experiment and see if it could. I was really delighted to see in that particular project, we were able to help a set of different departments come to an agreement. And they said afterwards, they felt that in 6 weeks, we'd got more agreement and we'd delivered more than they had done in 15 years. So, you know, it's interesting. I pick up these little nuggets, and I was hearing it in trade, and I was hearing it in this area that is not part of the public work we share. But one of the exciting things is the fact that this way of working is incredibly optimistic. It's very collaborative, but it's also very fast. And that really suits the kind of modern political environment, because it allows you to ground in that prototyping, test if something's going to work before you experiment at scale on a country, or you know, go through the process of legislation, which in itself takes time. So we see these kind of feedback loops as being really crucial. And sorry to kind of give it, I would like to give you a tangible example. Mike Bracken at the Government Digital Service said the tax office wanted to change the law so you could download your data onto a CD-ROM. He said, but the problem was by the time it went through the legislation, no one was using CD-ROMs anymore. And so the ability for government to be far more agile and far more responsive to those changing technologies, a changing context, is our sweet spot.
And I just wondered, I'm seeing a start in the New Zealand government of using accelerator programs, hackathons, and a bit to try and do some of that team sort of, you know, thinking. What's the experience within UK government agencies? You know, what sort of ways are they finding successful, not successful, to actually get from, you know, this is how we've always done it, to what we need to be doing differently now?
So we've done quite a lot of hackathons, and we've used that kind of approach in the lab and also outside of the lab. I think there's lots of experimentation that happens, and one of the things that in Cabinet Office, being a central kind of part of government, our role is also to say, well, what's the emerging practice? How do we harmonise that? So we work with the policy profession as a whole across all departments. But what we want to do is we want departments to be experimenting, but we also want to codify that and turn that into a new way of working that will benefit all civil servants. In the lab, we're quite fortunate. We work with the willing, so the departments who want to work with us approach us, and they also commission us and pay for our work, which puts us in an unusual position. But then what we try to do through the showcasing of those examples, and then the teaching through civil service learning and through other more broadcast, is to kind of get a broader take-up of those ways of working. But we're really, really tiny. I mean, our team are 8 people, and there are 380,000 people in the organisation as a whole, so we're quite small.
We'll take one more, and then we'll move on to these.
Who's going to get it? Hold on.
My question is ministers. So Francis Maude has been a big advocate.
He has.
Work. So, I mean, I don't know how others might have had an experience, but I've certainly not had a minister that's really stood up and supported this. So what was it that kind of allowed for you to do that? And the other ministers other than Francis Maude who are kind of talking about this stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. And Francis Maude has been really pivotal in the development of Government Digital Service, and he had less of an influence in the setting up of the policy lab, but certainly he has commissioned, and people who work for him have commissioned us. But we also worked with ministers in the Department for Education. We had a minister come to our Open Ideas Day, and he set the challenge in the morning. We then worked with businesses all day to come up with new ideas for childcare, and then he came back at 4 o'clock to hear the ideas that are generated and to feed back to the participants which ones he thought and how he would respond to that. It was incredible. We did that in the Shard in London, the big kind of glass building. We also worked with the Deputy Prime Minister in the previous coalition on a project where we were looking at the whole Northern Futures, 8 cities across the north, and the Deputy Prime Minister set the challenge, and then we were able to go back to him, and he then went through, and he sat all day in a Dragon's Den style pitch, hearing the ideas from the north of the country, and those ideas went into that autumn statement and then were funded. So I think it is true that some ministers have more appetite for it than others. You would expect that. But I think everyone, the civil servants, the policy community, the wider community, know that there is an imperative for change, and our public services need to be more human, they need to be more inclusive and more responsive. So I genuinely feel like that it's a good time, and that more often than not, people are approaching us and we're having to not, we don't have enough capacity to respond to the demand that we're seeing, and that I think is a good place to be.
There was a gentleman there who had his hand up since the start, so I'm just
Sorry.
Just a question about diversity of I was thinking in particular of the export one, and just whether you had any comment on that about diversity, because you could in an export thing get people with views about carbon miles, free trade. It could be quite polarised quite easily politically. Any comments around that sort of experience or how to deal with that or insights?
So the framing of the challenge is really important. On the exports, pretty much most things were open for possibility. On exports, what was interesting is that the managing director and chief executive of the department came up with a question. They said, how can exporting be effortless for business? We then went out and met with businesses across the country and connected them with embassies around the world. And the feedback that we were getting was businesses were saying export should never be effortless, and we don't want to call it export, it should be called international trade. So there's an immediate, obvious disconnect between what the department thought the policy intent was and what the businesses were asking for. Really good ideas came out of that. But in a different one, again working with business, we were looking at reducing regulation and cutting out red tape. And again, we went to the business and said, what red tape do you want reducing? And we had to be really clear about what red tape we could and couldn't control in that. So certain areas we had to say were off limits. And frankly, all of those businesses, some of them said, look, we still care and we want you to log this, our concerns, but they were still fine about the fact that there was real work to be done in another area. So I think it's really important to be honest when you're doing co-design with participants about, what are the opportunities to influence, and where there is real, genuine intent to hear that and act on it, and where it is more kind of advisory or broader than that. But we haven't had any issues with that. It's really important to set the framework.
Okay, we're going to stop it there.
Okay, thank you.
You're done.
I'm done. I'm done. Thanks.